Okay, this is a walkthrough of the second practice test. So I'm going to show you the questions that are on the practice test, give you a sense of how they relate to the questions that are in the pools that your actual test will be drawn from, and give some advice about organizing your notes and that sort of thing. So the first two questions on the practice test are drawn from the first section of the review sheet. So let's go over here and take a look at the review sheet. So you should have downloaded a review sheet that looks like this. It's got a section on the characters, right? And then a section on philosophical concepts. It's got a total of 5 sections. And for each one, there are going to be 2 questions. So you will have 2 questions on the characters. And so what you need to know there is, for characters that are new, you need to know who they are. For characters that are old, you want to know what we've learned about them in the new chapter. And there's a pool of questions about characters, and your test will have randomly generated 2 questions from that. We'll select randomly 2 questions from that pool. On the practice test, the first question is an essay question or short answer question about Deborah Lax. So in section 2 of the book, the section that this test covers, we learn more about her childhood and her adolescence and just more about her backstory. So I imagine that if you were taking notes on the review sheet, you probably have something that looks like this, right? So this is a sample. You go down to Deborah Lax, and what I wrote here in my sample notes is, we get more of Deborah Lax's backstory in this section. In chapter 15, we learn about her incredibly difficult childhood. It was a life filled with physical, psychological, and emotional abuse. So let's see. I've got like 100 words worth of notes here. I'm only supposed to do 30 to 40 words. I'm going to, so we wanted just to talk about her childhood. So what do we know about her childhood? Her childhood was filled with, and then I'm going to copy and paste, physical, psychological, and emotional abuse. Oh yeah, when her mother died, no one told her the siblings would happen. Her mother was just gone. And she was raised. You know, I can probably move all of this over. I hate it when the when the formatting comes over like that. Hang on. Let me do this. Redo. Undo. All right, I tell you what I do. And I'm just letting you know this because I love you. And I want you to succeed. This is a trick when you're doing online classes, right? Teachers can recognize when you've cut and paste text from somewhere else. In this case, it's just from your notes, not someone else's notes, from your notes. So it's okay. But you want to be sure to strip the formatting off. So what you want to do is I just open up a text editor like this that doesn't have formatting and paste into that, right? And then I cut, and then I go back here, and it should paste in without the formatting. Okay. So that's 58 words. That's a little long, but I mean that's fine. That lets you this explains what's going on. All right. The Gila bomb is number 2. So the second item, or one of the later items on the review, the character sheet, is Gila. Gila, we're imagining, is a character in this story. We do follow it along like it was a character. And one of the crazy things that happened was that it turns out that cell cultures all over the world were contaminated with Gila cells. And this actually just, there were theories about spontaneous switching of cells, which actually just turned out to actually be the taking over of the culture by the contamination from the HeLa cells. So the contamination just like changed what the whole theories were developed that were false because people didn't realize that HeLa was just everywhere. All right. The next two questions are about philosophical terms. So one is about active and passive uses of power. Let's look over at the review sheet for that section. So, right, some of the stuff in this section is carried over from last time. So you have all of the principles from the Belmont report: autonomy, beneficence, justice, respect for persons, and that sort of thing, informed consent. But you also have some new terms from some of the readings, including the readings by Miranda Fricker and Alison Reicheld. And one of those is from the Fricker, which is then picked up by Reicheld, about active and passive uses of power. And this is all ultimately about the phrase testimonial injustice. So I posted a video that talked about Fricker and testimonial injustice. The basic idea is simple, right? Testimonial injustice is when someone doesn't believe you because of who you are, because you're a woman or because you're a minority. It can also be if something happens when someone gives you too much belief because you belong to a dominant group. But that's less of a big deal than what they call a credibility deficit. Well, in any case, in the discussion of testimonial injustice, Fricker talks about active and passive uses of power, and she gives just a simple example here. She says a traffic warden. I bet she's British or something, but we'll just use a traffic cop or right. Passive. Traffic slows down when people see a cop. Active. A policeman actually writes a ticket. In the passive use of power, the mere presence of the powerful person changes social reality. Actually, in the case of the speed trap, changes behavior because that's physical reality. It is. The agent isn't actually doing anything, right? In active power, the agent actually does something. I'm going to fix my little typo here. And this should be sufficient for an answer because I've given you an example and I've given you a definition, and that is what the question called for. All right, the social constructivist theory of race. This was from Charles Mills. Charles Mills talks about how race isn't a biological reality. There's no particular reason why we should group people together in the way that we do. There's nothing biologically in common is had by all and only members of a single race. But race is a social reality. It's constructed out of people's actions. So the correct answer here is the first one. Races acquire a kind of social reality. So there are no racial essences. That would be racial realism. But you're not free to create your racial identity for yourself, at least not if you expect to have other people acknowledge it. So you get social constructivism. Okay. Number 5, the next pool is about the terms from critical thinking, and all of these are just carried over from the previous test. They are the same. You can use your same notes. However, this example in the practice test gives you an example of a new kind of question. It's a sorting or a classification question. So one of the things I emphasized early in the semester was the difference between normative and descriptive statements. A normative statement is just any statement that has a should in it. That should could be explicit or it could just be implied, but normative statements are about the way the world should be, and descriptive statements are about the way the world is. And I find it helpful, just as a bit of critical thinking, to always remember whether you're talking about the way the world should be or the way the world is. And you need to be talking about both of them all the time, right? Because you're trying to change the world to the way it should be, or at least the way you think it should be. But you need that distinction. So descriptive statements are about the way the world is, but they don't have to be true. False statements about the way the world is count as descriptive too. So for this question, you just grab the items here and you put them in the little box. So the grass on the campus of LCCC is pink. That is a descriptive statement. It's false, but it's descriptive. Gravity causes objects near the Earth to accelerate at a rate of 9.8 meters per second per second. That's just basic physics, and that's descriptive. Torturing babies for fun is wrong. This is, I think, I use this as an example of an obviously true moral statement most of the time. So it helps if people start saying, oh, morality is all relative or anything like that. You can always just pull this one out. Torturing babies for fun is wrong. But this is a should statement. It's about the way the world should be. I'm saying you shouldn't do this. So this one gets dragged over here. The next two examples both have shoulds in them explicitly. Children should ask to be excused before leaving the dinner table, when in fact they may not. My children don't. So it's a should. It may not be a moral should. It depends on how you understand the relationship between etiquette and morality. A good horror movie should have a surprise ending. That's another should statement. And then these others are descriptive. The sky is partly cloudy. That's just about the world that we can sense. England Has a Queen is about the social world, but it's not about the way the social world should be. It's just about what the actual practice in England is. All right. You're going to have one of these questions here where you put an argument in canonical form, also called standard form. So what that means is you list the premises and the conclusions and separate out the indicator words. Look here, you've got an indicator word right there, that therefore. That means that what comes after it is a conclusion. But notice actually that in this case that you have the right to sell your non-vital organs for profit. That's a conclusion. You can tell that. That's also the thing that is at the beginning of the statement, the beginning of the passage. You have a right to sell your non-vital organs for profit. In this case, the conclusion of the passage has been stated twice, once at the beginning and once at the end. This is a very strong way to write. I recommend, since your conclusion is always the most important thing that you're in what you say, it's good to put it in prominent positions, like both the beginning and the end. However, when we put it in standard form, we only need to do it once, and we just mark it with a C. So this is an argument in favor of organ selling, which is a fun topic in bioethics that we're not covering this semester. And then the other statements are going to be premises. If you have a right to control something, you also have the right to exchange it on a free market. For instance, if you own a car, you have the right to control over it, and part of this means having the right to sell the car. You have control over your own body, therefore you have a right to sell your non-vital organs for profit. The example of the car here is really just a specific example of the general principle. If you have the right to control something, you have the right to exchange it on a free market. So we're going to copy that. That's the main premise. And rather than putting all that stuff in the middle, I'm just going to put in parentheses here, for instance, you can sell your car. Other people, when given this example, will actually list the car thing as a separate premise, but really it's just an example to illustrate the general principle. And then you have control over your own body, right? And so this is then just an argument from bodily autonomy to the idea that you should be able to sell your organs. And then the indicator word is therefore. So I think we've hit all the tricky ones on this, but I'm going to continue running through the last 4 questions just to remind you of sources that you need to be reading. Which of the following describes the rough outline of history and consent of Western thought according to Johnston? So this was an essay that I had you read. I did a short video on it, and it gave a big picture outline of ideas about consent in history. The point being that these days in medical ethics, we take consent to be the centerpiece of everything, the linchpin. Everything depends on informed consent. But actually, ideas about informed consent have changed over time. And in particular, it waxes and wanes. Some societies have been very consent-oriented and others not. Right now, it's probably Western European societies are more consent-oriented than almost any other society in history. So actually the correct answer here is B. It played a moderate role in ancient history, and consent during the Middle Ages became really not a big deal at all. It wasn't part of people's theory of government or social practice. But in the Renaissance, it comes back and it now dominates personal and political theory. Chester Southam's tumor implantation experiments in the 50s and 60s, this was the subject of the chapter of the book, Illegal, Immoral, and Deplorable. So Southam was injecting people with cancer cells to see if the cancer would take, whether it would metastasize. And what he learned is that it metastasized in people who were already sick, but not in people who were healthy. That's this one here. But these weren't conducted in secret. These were conducted, these studies, like the Tuskegee study, were just published in medical journals, and the medical establishment talked about them, even if the newspapers did not. It did not become well known until the late 70s. No, this story broke in the early 60s, although it follows a similar pattern, actually, where young Jewish people who grew up hearing about the Holocaust recognized this pattern from their stories of their parents. But this actually broke in the 60s. So that one's false. Prisoners at the Ohio State Penitentiary were injected with cancer cells without being told what those injections were. No, actually, the prisoner experiments had informed, the prisoners were informed. You can ask whether if you're a prisoner you can really consent, but they definitely were informed. So there's actually only one of the 4 answers is correct here. Consent, according to Kleinig. The important thing for consent here is that, consent is a communicative action, and we know it has to be fundamentally a matter of communication because consent has this amazing property, amazing power. Consent turns an immoral act into a moral one. That's kind of freaky if you think about it. And it can only do that if it's a social thing. So the theory he's rejecting is the theory that consent is just a state of mind. It's not about whether you find this agreeable or not, although that can be relevant in terms of whether or not your consent is sincere or forced. This also relates back to something I had you do an exercise about, which was the widespread practice of vaginal exams on women who are fully sedated. This happens all over the U.S. If you get general anesthesia for surgery, often medical students will conduct a gynecological exam on you just to practice. And the standard practice of hospitals is not to get consent for it. The justification being that the doctors don't feel like this is a sexual activity, which is true, but under this theory of consent, that's not the point, right? Because consent isn't directly about your feelings or the feelings of the person who failed to get consent. It is fundamentally a communicative action. All right, last question. Reichelt. Reichelt has a nice essay. It's not published yet, but I love to teach it because I think it brings together a whole bunch of different ideas that are really important. So she's talking about testimonial injustice, which we saw from Miranda Fricker. Some people aren't believed. Well, in particular, in a medical context, certain groups of people aren't believed when they speak to doctors. Reichelt's 3 examples here are black people, women, and fat people. And this is actually a pretty, once you throw in all those groups of people, this is a pretty large chunk of the population. And she also says that this testimonial injustice, for instance, black people are less likely to be believed when they say that they are in pain. She says that this comes actually from stereotypes or controlling images. And her reason for this is that the testimonial injustice is domain specific. It only comes up in areas relating to the stereotype. So she actually has an argument here. And these last questions are going to be about people's arguments. What she says is testimonial injustice comes from stereotyping. How can you tell? Because it only happens in the areas where the stereotype is present. So African Americans are not believed in their pain reports, but they are believed if they say things like, I fell off a ladder and I broke my leg, right? So the doctor doesn't doubt that they fell, but they do doubt the pain report. So the last 2 questions will be about Kleinig and Reichelt. So you should be sure to have notes on those. Read those articles, pull out the most important parts. Go ahead and use my PowerPoints as guides to what's important. Take down that stuff. The process of assembling notes and thinking through these issues is itself educational. And the test is just a confirmation that you've gone through the process. All right. Good luck.